You know you're kind of over the target of society when you see what people are laughing at.
You can't fake funny, right?
It's not to like punch up or punch down or speak truth to power. That's all part of it. But really, it's like just observe reality and how absurd it is. People will be like, oh, the state of comedy. I'm like, comedy's doing great, actually.
Moral panics, they're as old as civilization, right?
The gatekeepers still exist. They're just algorithms now. What idiot thought it was a good idea to dare teenagers not to do drugs? Can jokes go too far? Yes. Should you be allowed to make whatever joke you want? Yes.
We need to laugh a lot more because you're right. Literally, none of us are getting out alive.
Was it worth it, Bridget, so that you could laugh at the leader of the free world? Yes. Yes, it was.
Well, hello, everybody. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with yet another Infinite Loops. I have been looking forward to this interview for a long, long time. My guest is the very funny and yet also weirdly, amazingly serious in certain aspects, Bridget Phetasy, who hosts The Dumpster Fire, who's a writer, a podcast host, a stand-up comedian. You are a burgeoning media mogul, just all on your own, Bridget. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. We contain multitudes, as you were saying.
We do indeed. So I literally stumbled on your podcast when somebody sent me a clip from it. And I'm not like, as I was mentioning before we started, like I'm an old, I remember comedy as like George Carlin, Richard Pryor, loved comedy, have a daughter was a stand-up comedian. And like literally you just cracked me up. And I think it's hysterical that now you have this great line, which is to be considered a dissident these days, all you have to do is assert that men have penises, women have vaginas, boom, dissident.
Yep. I'm a dissident.
So that's kind of my first question. I kind of look at comedy as I'm a huge First Amendment guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and including people saying shit that I do not believe or agree with at all.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm kind of a First Amendment absolutist, other than burning theaters and all that kind of stuff, right? But so, like, how did you get into where you are right now with Dumpster Fire? And what was the moment you're like, Jesus, somebody's got to like keep comedy alive here?
I mean, it is very much alive. I actually was, I think I'm going to write a follow-up to a piece I wrote in 2019, Comedy's Last Stand for the Washington Examiner. And I was talking about at that time in the culture, comedy was a little bit on its heels. We had this ridiculous article in Vulture about how we're now in a post-comedy world where laughing isn't the point of comedy. And Hannah Gadsby was really huge at the time. And everybody's getting up and it feels a little bit more like a confessional, strange piece of performance art instead of just comedy, which is, to just make you laugh theoretically. And I was asking whether or not these kind of guys who were, they were too big to fail at the time that this had happened. So you had guys like Rogan and Kevin Hart and Bill Burr. They were already famous. They kind of were like, we don't care. We're going to say what we want to say. And was that torch going to be able to be passed down to another generation, or was that kind of it? And Andrew Schultz sold out Madison Square. So I asked at the end of the piece, will these guys like Tim Dillon and Andrew Schultz and Shane Gillis be able to kind of carry on? And like, clearly they have. Shane Gillis has a show coming out on Netflix. He has probably dodged a massive bullet by not being constrained by what he would have been constrained on Saturday Night Live, famously kind of canceled for Saturday Night Live for those listeners who don't know. and had a triumphant return to Saturday Night Live as a host. Madison Square Garden was sold out by Andrew Schultz 2 nights in a row, which is insane. And Tim Dillon makes, millions of dollars a year on Substack. He's touring and doing, all these guys are doing stadium tours and theaters. I mean, they're massive. We had the roast of Tom Brady recently, which I think was a watershed moment for comedy. Kevin Hart, who was taken off of, hosting the Oscars. Tony Hinchcliffe, who kind of navigated a cancel culture attempt, who's now was on the cover of Variety recently. I mean, I think comedy held the line. That's my long answer, is that people will be like, oh, the state of comedy. I'm like, comedy's doing great, actually. It's people are joining in massive numbers. The scene in Austin is supportive and amazing. It's like, it seems like I think it did. I was joking about this at that event, the Dissident thing. Like, we held the line. People will say to me, like, oh, it's nice to see like retarded and gay coming back into the lexicon. I'm like, some of us never stopped. Thank you very much. We held the line. I think that there's we'll see what happens, and we'll see what happens if Trump wins. I don't know what that will look like culturally, but right now it's a boom.
And the thing about Trump, I think I recall you saying something along the line of that you just can't figure out who to vote for, the guy with the brain worm, the guy with no brain, or Trump. And then you concluded that Trump at least is really good for comedy. Like,
it's funny. I've seen like a couple. I was at the mothership over the weekend just watching some friends who are in town doing their weird Kyle. Do you know Kurt Metzger and Kyle? They have this show called Pussies, pardon my language. And it's like
by the way, Bridget, you can say fuck, shit,
okay,
anything you want to say on this podcast.
It's basically them doing their impression of like male feminists. They're kind of these like Pacific Northwest guys. It has a very Portlandia vibe, but they were doing it live and they were kind of roasting comedy, or not roasting, as they would say, baking. And then they had all these comedians kind of opening in between. And it's funny, like you're kind of over the target of society when you see what people are laughing at. That's what I love about comedy. And Jerry Seinfeld recently said this, like, the audience lets you know immediately where they're at. And Tyler Fisher was joking about how very similar, like, you have this guy who's like RFK Jr., who's got a brain worm and sounds like he has a hair caught in his throat. And you have a guy who's literally, I don't even think, home 90% of the time. And then Trump, who's like, what did he say recently? I played it in the green room at the mothership, and it was like, they were all telling me it was AI. I'm like, I don't think this is AI. It was him talking about Hannibal Lecter. They're like, this is AI. I'm like, no, guys, it's like trending on Twitter. I think it's like a real thing that he said. They're like, no way, that's not real. I'm like, but the funny thing is, it took me a while to figure out if it was real or AI. Trump is so ridiculous. He sounds like AI, an AI made up version of him.
Yes. Well, I've always thought that about Trump, is that he kind of leaned in. He figured out, look, I'm a cartoon character, so I'm going to go all in. I'm going all in on being, the gold toilets and naming kids Barrett and like
Hannibal Lecter, a very nice man. I mean, he wants to be a stand-up comedian so badly. He just
seems
does.
That way to me too. He really, really does, because I know, great guy, wonderful guy. Yeah, eats humans, but we can overlook that.
It's like he knows exactly how to just control a news cycle. He knows no matter what he says, it's going to be taken out of context and clipped. He just is. It's really incredible. And then when I saw that, I was like, I don't want to vote for him, but I kind of do want to vote for him for like
Just for
all the wrong reasons.
the
For
comedy.
completely the wrong reasons. America might burn, and I will still be like, maybe it was worth it. Just as I'm eating like rats over an oil drum. Was it worth it, Bridget, so that you could laugh at the leader of the free world? Yes. Yes, it was.
But as you point out in a recent show, I don't think that even Donald Trump could kill a fucking puppy and get away with it. You think?
No.
He could definitely shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue, like he said famously, and get away with it.
But we know that now. He was right.
and what's so funny is like last night we have guests, and my wife was just like, just put something mindless on, and I'm like, well, okay, so let's watch John Wick. Like, let's see how that much has changed, because it was made like 10 years ago, and I saw it when it came out, right? And I didn't really realize that, like, because I love Keanu and most of his stuff, but like, there it is. You stole my car and you killed my fucking dog. That's why I am going on a rampage. I'm going to bring down the entire Russian mob in one fell swoop.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just like, and you pointed out, which is great. One of the things I love about you is like, there's a lot of people who aren't saying anything, right? And you said earlier, you can tell what the mood of the country is by what are people laughing about, right?
Yeah.
And I saw your recent dumpster fire where you were talking about all the protests going on, and I love the line: "Real revolutionaries don't need dental dams." You know, you bitches, go on and raw dog it. It's like, it just seems to me, again, as like, I grew up on all of, like Richard Pryor, all those guys, and there was this lull where it did seem to me for a little bit like, holy shit, they're going to even silence the comics, right?
Yeah.
And so what do you think? Do you think that it was just that things are so absurd right now that people are just like, I got to at least laugh about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's so necessary. And like I was saying at this event where I was kind of roasting the event, but also trying to be somewhat serious in the tone of the event about just how stand-up is a uniquely American art form. It is like jazz. It's like, it is born it is born out of our First Amendment. You could not get away with this and get away with some of the crap we say. I do ultimately think it's a good thing to be able to see what people believe, because privately held beliefs are often dangerous in the sense that you have people meeting and gathering in hoods, like we generally want to know who those people are. I know it might be crazy, but I'd rather know that my neighbor Jim, who's, I like a lot of the stuff we're seeing is I'm like, it's free markets and free speech. Like, that's a very interesting intersection of things with technology. Now, when you have government putting their finger on the lever of all of this and big corporations deciding what is and isn't good, and then you also have bad ideas spreading like wildfire, true misinformation, AI, lies, like, I don't really know how it's all going to play out, because I don't have to deal with some teenager making a video of me in a porn as a teen, but I do have to worry about that for my daughter. And I don't know how we're going to navigate that. Like, that stuff is far more sinister and evil, and it should be a crime. And I don't know why it's not a federal crime to do these things. So and then it's like gets into this libertarian idea of like, now you have the government regulating certain portions of the internet. And I don't know. I don't know how this all plays out, truly.
Well, I think it's also another thing about there seems to me to be like a growing group of people who just feel they have no like everything has become so politicized
Yeah.
that for a while I was just like, you know what, a pox on all of it. Like
All of it.
in my opinion, we have the worst political class on both sides of the aisle. I'm not picking sides here that like America has ever had. But then you like go back and you look at American history and the shit that used to go down in this country, like was
Right.
I mean, like people getting in fist fights on the Senate floor in the House, people killing each other. Like if you know the history, like you know.
I mean, when you think about the fact that, and this is what I've said this before on podcasts, like my drunk aunt will be like, well, the younger generation will be like, you don't know how bad it is. She's like, we had a sitting president get assassinated, and then his brother, and then Martin Luther King Jr. So like things were really bad. There were riots in every major city. We lived through that. I've been doing this stand-up routine about how America's too fat for a civil war. And fat literally, but I also think that is like metaphor, there's like a metaphor there too. Everything is too convenient. Everything is too easy. How are you going to like really, Jim, you're going to go shoot your neighbor because of the bathrooms, like what is this war about exactly? Like what exactly is happening here? And I've been watching the Ken Burns documentary because often you'll get like the more knowledge you can have about a topic, obviously, the more ability there is to make jokes and go in different directions. And like the Civil War was so freaking gnarly, but also they had so many more basic skills than the average American. And I had the guy who does Grand Thumb, the YouTube channel on, and his whole thing that we were talking about that when he was on my podcast was basically he does like survival skill classes, and he's like, don't worry, come out. We'll get you to the basic skill set of an 8-year-old in the 1860s. It's like we've lost a lot. We have lost a lot. I mean, an 8-year-old in the 1800s was much more competent than the average grown man in America now, which is crazy.
Yeah. And it's also like with the protests going on here in New York, like you just have to kind of look and think, really, seriously? You are a in quotes revolutionary, and you want like DoorDash, you want mental health.
They're
you
like
want safe
passing
spaces.
the torch on their food hunger strike. Like I don't think that's how it works, guys. It's not a relay race. You're not like, all right, we'll take one day, you guys take the next day. Like that's not how that's literally not what a hunger strike is. You don't get to be like 1 out of every 4 days I'm fasting. That's just like being a white chick in Los Angeles.
Yeah, the cleanse. Cleanses are
congratulations.
So important,
you're an actress in Los Angeles. That's the diet you guys are on.
So back to New York and the dissident dialogues. So what sparked that? And are we at a tipping point? Do you think are we at a point where people are just like, you know what? Fuck it. I think this is what I'm going to say. I'm not going to give false. I had a physical therapist once, and he was a young guy, and we used to talk about a bunch of stuff, and I would ask him, how many of your actual opinions do you share with your friends? Not like just people you know, but your friends. And like he looked at me, paused, and he goes, I am so fucking tired of faking every single one of my opinions. And it seemed like that was in 2018 or 19. And it does seem to me as I watch things unfold that there seems to be less of younger people like faking their opinions. Do you agree?
Yeah. Again, it can all, it's so, it's interesting. Because that could all change if Trump got elected again. You know, I do have someone who listens to all of my podcasts and really believes, and this is a piece I really should try and write and articulate because I've talked about it a lot on podcasts. Like the only real fundamental ideology that exists in America is but the right. So the left can be like, you know, censoring corporate and tech can be in cahoots. We can have them mutilating children and sterilizing gay kids, and then we'll be like, but the right, you know, and I understand that coming from the left, like that's in my DNA, is that somehow no matter what the left does, I still worry more about what the right's doing. Part of that is I think the right wing reaction to things like, you know, I mean, it is a little bit like communism and fascism playing out against one another. And generally, neither one of those things are good for the people. So and I think I just worry more about the right, probably because they're more armed than the left in general. I think they've actually been quite patient. Like, we should actually be giving them a little more credit. It sounds like someone who's being held emotionally hostage. So yeah, I think there is this like very real worry amongst most left wing or people who come from the left that the right, no matter what is going down in America, is somehow going to be worse than whatever the left might be doing. So that being said, it's a long way for me to say right now, I think the tide has turned. And if Trump gets elected, I think we'll be thrown back into, people have completely erased how absolutely insane everybody was during that time. They have spotlessly sunshined it out of their minds. They have erased it from themselves. If they behave that way, they act like they didn't. I wrote this piece recently about Sydney Sweeney the reaction was like, "Oh, excuse me, what?" I'm like, "You guys all want to pretend you weren't crazy people marching in knit pussy hats like 5, 6, 7 years ago?" And I remember, some of us remember, it's like my car has been forcing me to listen to a podcast I did with Sam Morril, a comedian in New York, brilliant comedian. And it was right when things were starting to open up in 2021 in New York City. And then when I was listening to it, I'm like, this was insane. Looking back, it is so bonkers, and everybody's just tra-la-la on and acted like it didn't happen. And I was watching his documentary that he did at the time that he was promoting when he was on my podcast the other night, Full Capacity. And even that stuff was so ridiculous and stupid. And everyone just let the governments that did this, particularly left-wing states, completely off the hook for being like the plexiglass they were telling jokes behind in these boxes and 30% capacity. Like that makes it. And everybody's just like moved on. And so I think people underestimate how insane it's going to get if Trump wins. I don't think people, for some reason, they've forgotten how insane it was. And this time it will be post January 6th, post all of his legal troubles, be whether they're, lawfare or actually legitimate, it's still going to be. So I don't know if it's like, my question is this rubber band snap back? Like right now, has it just expanded? Rogan single-handedly kept the Overton window from slamming shut. during that time. People they've gotten enough escape velocity in the time of Biden to, Barry created the free press. You have Glenn Greenwald went and did his own thing. So Russell Brand, a lot of these people have gone from their mainstream havens to create their own things that will hopefully keep stuff more sane than it was in 2016. Like, that's my hope, is that some infrastructure has actually been created in the last 4 years to withstand that snapback, but we'll see. We'll see.
What was, what's really funny about that is, like, I was one of the original Trump haters way back in the 80s. And I hated him because
I
he
just
was
always
like,
hated him.
he was just as I mentioned earlier, this cartoon character. And then after he got elected, like, I found myself around, like, most of my friends, my family, etc. So some of them have, like, had the deepest Trump derangement syndrome.
Yeah.
That I was
devotions
forced,
derangement. Yeah.
derangement. And I was like sitting at dinner.
Don't make me defend him.
And exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm like, are you really going to do this to me? And then I would bring up my bona fides, right? Like, do you guys remember back in the 80s when I said I would never go into a Trump building because, and they're like, nope, we memory hold that. Everything he does is bad. As a matter of fact, when he was leaving office, I actually did something I hadn't done in ages. And that was, I sent an email, of course unread, to the White House saying, if you really want to fuck with people, what you ought to do is give a blanket pardon to everyone in U.S. prisons confined for a non-violent drug offense.
Yeah.
Let's see how the other side reacts to that. Because my bet was, if he did that, like, the Democrats would get all like, you can't release these people. These people are criminals. It's just so bizarre to me, because basically I don't have a political party. I'm, like, just fiercely anti-authoritarian. And, I don't know, 25 years ago, that made me a raving liberal. What do you mean that people should be able to do what they want within, all these things? And then move forward 20 years and all of a sudden, like, I'm a troglodyte, slack-jawed troglodyte, conservative. It's just so bizarre. It's so bizarre to me that classical liberalism, which was all about freedom of thought, freedom of expression, all of the things that, as you say, made this country, right? So suddenly those things are all bad. Like, we're the baddies now.
Yeah, it's so weird too, because I feel like so much of our politics could be, it's like weird. We play the tape forward in doomsday scenarios. We don't play the tape forward in times where people are being hyperbolic about certain individuals and what they're capable of. Like, I would find myself saying to my left-wing friends, so you really think Trump is going to, like, because they'd be defending themselves saying he's literally Hitler. I'm like, you really think he's going to put millions of people on trains and then go dispose of, like, who are these people that, like, what class? And they would, in all seriousness, believe this. So I don't know how to, if that is truly your belief that he's capable of it just sounded hilarious to me. Like, the idea that this guy is going to round up, like, who's he rounding up? First of all, what is the population? Just people who don't like him? Because that seems like, if we're going to be real, it's not going to be any. It's going to be people who are mean to him.
Yeah, we're going to need a lot more trained people who don't like him.
But it's like, the guy, he loves. It's not going to be some race, because he's talking about, like, the Mexican guys who love him, and, like, it's just like, who exactly is the class of people that Trump is rounding up on these trains in your literal Hitler scenario and sending off to gas chambers? If this is literal, like, what? I feel so bad for you that this is the world you occupy, because it's not the world most normies occupy. And I have people online who are like normies, people who spend too much time on Twitter and probably too much time listening to podcasts. And they're like, normies are the problem. I'm like, are they the problem, or are they just keeping all you lunatics from going insane? And we've done these jokes on Dumpster Fire of like, we've kind of alluded to progressivism. We're like, is it a slippery slope? Because as you see it like go down to like, okay, so were the conservatives right about a lot of this stuff? I don't think so. I'm still pro gay marriage, but what's going on with all this trans stuff? Like, is it a direct result of like, do whatever you want, be whoever you want to be? It doesn't feel very liberal though. Like their whole, the trans activists kind of compelled speech. When you really get down their rabbit hole, nothing about it feels liberal. It feels very, again, like authoritarian, or as I oftentimes joke, patriarchy so crafty. It's very confusing time for people. And my husband and I were talking about this because there's not really like a shared, it's not like we have Roseanne to gather around and laugh at. There's not a shared just like piece of cultural, just like a sitcom that everybody can kind of gather around and be like, ha ha ha, this is exactly how we feel. And my husband and I were talking, and I've had this conversation with a lot of couples. It seems like couples more and more are getting together and they're watching like Instagram reels together and sharing those and laughing at those together, because that's where the normies are. And the reels are so like relatable and hilarious. But I'm like, why hasn't anyone made a kind of sitcom that reflects what all these couples are sharing with each other on Instagram reels? Like, that experience is the shared American experience right now of the normie, like not even suburban, but just like the normie parent trying to navigate the very strange times we live in.
Yeah, we're doing a series called The Great Reshuffle. And basically how I think this fits in is like we did have a shared culture, right? But it was kind of a monoculture. That's what gave birth to the counterculture, right? In the 60s, because like I Love Lucy, 64 million viewers. I Love Lucy.
Right. But there wasn't much else.
No, of course. Exactly right. There were three networks. There were two newspapers that mattered. And so one of the things, the thesis that I have is it is the atomization of culture.
Right.
It is the fact that there are all sorts of little hills that you can do a power law on, right? Like podcasting. Oh, it's too late to get into podcasting. Oh, no, it isn't. Like there are so many different topics, right? But what gets lost then is that shared culture, right? Of like, yeah, Lucy was so funny. The closest we can get is like, yeah, that final to the Grand Game of Thrones really fucking sucked, right? And even then, it was only 18 million people watching it, right?
And it was a while ago. Like that was like the reference you're giving me is still like, what was that, like 6 years ago now that we had even that before it's all been fragmented? I don't know when it ended, but it feels like it was around 6 years ago, 2018 maybe.
And I think too, the other thing that's part of this is the old hierarchies are collapsing. And guess what? If you're at the top of the old hierarchy, you really don't like it when that hierarchy collapses. And so, for example, media, great example, right? So they used to call them the fifth or fourth estate, right? Because you made a tacit deal to be like a prestigious journalist, right? The deal was you weren't going to make a lot of money. You were probably going to never like own that beautiful penthouse in Manhattan, but you were going to be able to be part of the movers and shakers and whatnot, and shape opinion.
Yeah, you could go to you could go to the penthouse parties.
Exactly. And now, like, that's gone too, right?
Yeah, kind
And
of.
so, kind of, yeah. But the idea is that all of these people, and I don't want to just pick on the media, like everything got reshuffled, and like parts of it are great. Like your show is great. There's so many funny things on right now that if you love comedy, like it's great. But
Yeah.
that the breakdown of like I grew up watching Johnny Carson, right? And so like and he would do topical jokes, but they were like really mild, like compared
Yeah.
to. But he also introduced us to the next great generation of comics, right?
Yeah. We had the Kurt and Kyle show the other night. They're like, we're going to show you some comedy that we feel best represents the kind of comedy we want to bring into the world. And it was like Rosie O'Donnell crying basically about something with her kid. I mean, it's like these people that I don't know. I was watching it like, wow, I hope I never take myself that seriously, because you have to take yourself so seriously to be that kind of person. And we do live in such a weird time of, and I think again this is because of our mediation of everything, where everybody's their own brand, everybody has a voice. That's awesome. The gatekeeper, that I think it's good that some of these hierarchies are being like the towers are falling in the kind of symbolic tarot readings of time. And you have no gatekeepers really other than big tech. I mean, that the gatekeepers still exist. They're just algorithms now, which is why it's even more sinister and scary. So I would argue that the gatekeepers, there was a time where it was very free, but I think the gatekeepers are figuring out how to gatekeep just from a more sinister algorithmic, like who we're going to boost, who we're going to throttle, who will basically exist in the wasteland of nothingness, Bridget Phetasy, forever. Which is fine. I always joke like I'm still just happy to be here. They haven't like erased me yet. So that's a little more sinister, but I do find that people take themselves much more seriously than like the generation that I was raised. I don't know. My generation, Gen X, just like doesn't, as far as I can tell, has never been that interested in taking themselves all that seriously. And most of the people I know from my generation are similar, and like they like to take the piss out of each other, and they like to take the piss out of themselves, and life is somewhat absurd, and you have to be able to laugh at it and yourself. And I don't know, that's I I think Gen Z is a little bit more like that, but I think they're reacting to the kind of self-importance of the millennials that has been like pervasive. But it does seem to be waning. They're getting older. That generation's going to get older, and they're going to become less annoying, like all generations throughout time.
Exactly.
I mean, that's
And
my hope.
the self-important aspect of it too, that always grates on me. Like, are you fucking kidding me? Like, you're like, it just drives me crazy when I see these people, and it's just the word salads and the barfing up all of this.
It's
And we
religious.
totally,
It
yes,
reminds me of
yes,
when I grew up in the 80s, the like evangelical
yes.
Christian. I have the same visceral reaction to it that I had to people who were shaming people for swearing or taking the Lord's name in vain or whatever, like whatever minor microaggressive infraction of like your human soul. And the interesting thing is I see that coming back on the right. So back to my butt, the right. I think this is the right people are very afraid of, is this like puritanical, religious, like you were saying, self-importance of like, we are the pure ones and you're somehow beneath us. And now I see that return. The right had a minute. They had a moment. They squandered it because they can't help but punch themselves in the dicks over and over again. They had a minute, I think, to kind of capture a lot of the people who are lost in the center. What did a leftugee? Someone called himself a leftugee, which I thought was hilarious. I had never heard that term until recently. They were like fleeing the left, and there was a minute, just a hot minute, where it felt like the right was starting to capture some of that. They opened their tent a little bit more, and then, I think overturning of Roe v. Wade, whether I agree with that or not on a federalism, constitutional, that's accurate perspective. It wasn't good. And it reminded people of what's scary about the right. And now we're seeing online all the like Christ is king stuff. And people are like, okay. And this is what I said when I got kind of caught in the crossfire of the culture where it's coming from the left. I would be like, hey, free speech. And then in my mentions, it would be like, yeah, and like something racist and something misogynist. And I'd be like, oh, never mind. I'm not with you people either. Like, I think a lot of people feel that way right now, probably more than ever before in recent times.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's the whole, it's the tone deafness of, in quotes, elites in general, right?
Yeah.
On both parts of the political spectrum. I mean, the Apple ad. Like, are you fucking kidding me? That how many layers of Apple did that ad have to go through? and are you fucking kidding me that you make it all about look, I get it. I get the 30,000 level pitch that maybe Timmy Apple, as Trump would call him, got, right? It's like, no. It's, we compress all of these great things and all you need is an iPad, right? And
yeah.
But then you, like, I watched it. I had so many of my friends sending it to me and they're like, because I bought one of the first Macintoshes.
Yeah.
I loved Steve Jobs. I loved the Super Bowl ad of 1984.
The iPod commercials were the best with all the dancers. Those were my favorite.
Amazing.
They were amazing.
Mine too. They were brilliant, right? Because they were, that was Steve Jobs, right? And so I think that the tone deafness, like, so for example, you bring up the 80s, right? I used to love watching Jimmy Swaggart because I thought he was the funniest comic on TV. And his moment, like, they caught him with coke and whores and a bunch of other stuff. And it was a tour de force, his performance. It's like, yeah. I don't know, it must be on YouTube somewhere, but like, he's weeping and he's saying, I have sinned against the Lord.
Yeah.
And my wife would look at me and she's like, what are you doing? And I'm saying, don't you understand how funny this stuff is?
No, people don't.
They really don't. They really don't.
Yeah, and that ad too, I think they underestimated how much like 90s nostalgia there is in the zeitgeist right now. And 80s nostalgia for this analog time before we were all online, when there was a shared culture. I can't remember who it was, but someone wrote a great essay recently about how we're never going to escape the 90s because it was the last time we had a shared culture. And I'm like, well, that's great for me being a 90s kid, but not so great for everyone else. We'll be stuck in the 90s for eternity. But it is true. I think they just underestimated that. Like, there's just this more than ever, everything I see online, a lot of it is directed at me because of the algorithm, obviously, but I'm constantly getting these memes and reels, and it's like, this is how we knew who is home. Or like, this is how we knew where everybody was back in the day. And it's like all the different bikes on the yard. It's not like everybody's tracking each other on their apps and checked in. Like it was just like, oh, so and so is, everybody's bikes are here, and just these little like reminders of we had so much freedom. It is actually crazy. And it's hard not to, come back to this book that I read and I love, and I've been interviewing the guy who wrote it chapter by chapter on my podcast. Thomas de Zengotita mediated, and he has this whole concept of like Justin's helmet principle, which is you aren't going to be the parent that doesn't put the helmet on the kid because you know more now about head injuries. And so even though the kids are more bubble wrapped, are you going to be the parent? It's hard to push back against some of this stuff, give your kids freedom, but no, it was like, I feel like she's like under surveillance state with her nanny cam, but I can also check in with her when I'm away, and I like to be able to see her. And it's just, I'm like, she's growing up in we had like the stupid people are like, oh, aren't you worried that people can hack them? I'm like, we could hear neighbors' phone calls on our freaking baby monitors that we had. Like any creeper could have hacked into that like weird radio signal that we were using.
No question. And like, I'm a cusp baby boomer. I was born in 1960.
Yeah, you're a late boomer. That's what Nick Gillespie calls himself.
Yeah, Nick's a great guy. I
love
had
him.
I had him on the podcast, and very simpatico views on a lot of things. It's like
he's so smart.
He's totally a brilliant guy, and I subscribe to the idea that if you can infer all of my beliefs by hearing one of them, then I'm brain dead, right? Like I don't subscribe to, if I believe in a woman's right to choose, which I do, does that necessarily make all of these other things fall like dominoes into place, right?
Right.
And so it's just like the nuance of those times seems to have been completely lost, right? Like, so as an early boomer, I mean, my God, or late boomer, sorry, like we could do just anything. And I remember, like, I grew up in Minnesota, and in 1985, I had my first son. I was 24 years old. We got married young. We decided, well, fuck, we're gonna be crazy and get married at 22. Let's be young parents, because in my view, I wanted my children to like the same music I like.
Yeah.
But like, so they passed the seatbelt law in Minnesota, and I had just started wearing seatbelts because I'm a dad, right? And I'm thinking about it. But then, literally, when they passed the law, in protest, I stopped wearing seatbelts for like 6 months. Just because
a lot of people
are not going to tell me what to do.
When the lockdowns came, a lot of people were like, this goes back to the seatbelts. And I was like, what? I didn't understand it. And then I was like, oh, that is kind of a weird law. Like, it never really occurred to me that but then I was reading, that the kind of like, we read Bowling Alone for the Phetasy Book Club, which is a tome, but it's kind of famous. And we had a little book club about it, and my audience is so smart. But one woman was like, a lot of the things that he points to could be attributed to other things, like that kind of freakonomics idea where, well, yeah, clubs went down. It also went down very suspiciously at exactly the time they started instituting drunk driving laws. Like, you could just drive drunk for most of the 70s.
Absolutely.
And part of the 80s.
And that's the problem, right? Because as you were alluding to earlier, it's not a good idea to drive drunk.
No.
It's not a good idea to not wear a seatbelt. It's not a good, right? Like, so a lot of the things that kind of crept in, right, were like, of course you want your child to be safe. Of course, now that we know all of this about head injuries, like, of course I'm going to put a helmet on my child before he or she rides their bike. But then that kind of itself tipped, right? And it was like, you will be compliant. And like, it gives me hives when somebody is like pointing their finger at me and telling me, you're going to do this, this, and this. And I will literally go out of my way to do the opposite.
Yeah,
right?
You're a contrarian. I get it. it's tough to like
But even
fight
like
it.
definitions, right? It's like I always joke, the Woodstock of capitalism is Warren Buffett's confab that he has every year, right? And so my joke was like when you see him lining up and you see the number of the crowds, isn't it amazing that 45,000 contrarians are all together listening to another contrarian? It's
Yeah.
like how do you be contrary to contrarianism, right?
And it's not always cute. Like I see it in myself. I've had to. I think that makes it even harder to navigate this time because, like you and I both understand, like I didn't like Trump since the 80s or even 90s because I knew too many people in New York who were working class who had been like screwed over by him. I also had a friend who dated his daughter who knew things about, like, I just had heard what kind of a bombastic idiot he was. And he just didn't appeal to my own sensibility. People liked him and thought he was like this, but I just never really liked him. But then the contrarian in me is so much like, you that is the it's like the contrarian in me that wants him to win, even if it's like bad for America. That is not good. It's like not a great instinct that I have to. Navigating all of this weird time has been challenging too because I'm fighting against rejection by my peers. And I think it's easy, you've seen a lot of people go completely off the deep end because they're being rejected by their peers or rejected by an institution they respect or rejected. I don't think enough people have been aware of how much rejection has kind of, like, a reaction to being rejected has caused some kind of domino effect in their life. And then also just being a contrarian. Like if you're navigating being rejected and being a contrarian, it's not I have to. And then I'm like, what do I value? That's why I've said to people, like, in order to stay sane, you've got to just identify the hills you'll die on. Like for me, it's free speech. It's being able to call out reality, biological reality. Not many hills I will die on, but there are a couple. And then I can kind of, work from there. Is this something worth fighting for or is it not? I can't believe that, both the left and the right I've seen be like, oh, the election's already stolen. It's already rigged. It's already. If I believe that, then I have to just believe that democracy is already dead. So if I believe that there's no point in voting and I believe that the election's already rigged, or I believe whatever thing that these people on either side believe, if their side is losing, they don't believe it when their side wins, another miracle, then I would have to believe that democracy is already done. What would be, I can't start from that position because otherwise I have to believe that, like, my vote's being counted. The election is pretty much as I mean, I don't know. I think if I believe that, then like it leads to a lot of nihilism and cynicism that we see kind of everywhere.
Yeah,
Does
the not
anyone believe the election is like secure and good? Like, who's believing this? Because it seems like the left doesn't and the right doesn't. So I don't know who believes that our elections are actually secure and accurate.
Yeah. And I'm reminded of the quote by the author Jed McKenna, where he says, if you're having a little tea party with Lord Lion and Lady Gazelle, and somebody comes along who doesn't quite believe your little fantasy narrative, it's not that they're being mean. It's just that your reality might be a little fragile. And
Mm.
like, I love that line because that's another thing. And again, like you can easily dismiss me. Oh, he's old, or he's white, or he's a man, or whatever. But it just seems that, like, we talk about where all the bikes were, right? were we doing stupid, dangerous shit? Yes, we were.
Yes.
But that made us a bit more anti-fragile, in my opinion. Right?
God, I think about my parents letting us, like, we would be on the beach and we would all go. We were young, probably 10 and under, like a whole pack of us. And we would go on walk around the rocks and we'd be jumping into the ocean. You know, there was like we were little kids doing this. And I'm like, would I let my daughter do that? You know, like it's just, I don't know if it was a different mentality, if it was, I want to let my daughter do that. I want to think that I'm the kind of, like, I have that my own security of being able to, like, let her go and do these things. And it's like, we would, when I was like 12 years old, we would go to the train bridge and jump off the bridge into the freaking water and wait until the last minute when a train was coming. I mean, we did like the dumbest shit. That's one of many examples of dumb things that I can think of that we did when we were young. And I don't know. I mean, maybe kids are doing these things still.
Yeah. And it's like you also talk about normies. That's another thing. So I live in Metro New York, and when I was still had my old company and I had to go, on the road, I would joke to my wife, "Yeah, I'm going to real America."
Yeah.
And like, this is not real America
No.
to begin with, right? Neither is LA and San Francisco.
No.
But when you go to real America, I would often just find it like really reassuring, because it seems to me like your normie, your average real American, like most of them go along to get along, do what you want to do. Just don't infringe on my shit. Don't tell me that I have to do, X, Y, and Z to meet with your approval. And it does seem to me that it's almost like both coasts were always a bit crazy. We're always a bit, that way. But now, through the internet, through the dominance in media, through all of that, we're seeing things through a filter that just is a false filter that does not reflect the way you're at. And like, if you go to, I don't know, pick somewhere in the middle of the country, pick where I grew up. You go
where
to St. Paul,
I'm in like Normie-ville. I'm in a basic bitch suburb, in a suburb in the dead smack center of Texas. I am looking at 7 houses. I have an HOA. I'm looking at 8 houses that look somewhat similar to mine. It is the literally American dream. My daughter goes to Olive Garden with her grandparents every Tuesday night. Like, it is not anything coastal Bridget could have ever conceived of. But I grew up in Minnesota and graduated from high school in Minnesota, so it feels very familiar to me. Like, I graduated from Orono. That is like the whitest suburb in America, perhaps. And this suburb is nothing like it. It's actually quite diverse where I live. Most of my neighbors are Indian, Nigerian, and like young Texas families. I think the biggest problem is that young people aren't having kids. So like normie culture is very much centered around like people who have kids just trying to survive. And I'll have young people who don't have kids and even older people who don't have kids sending me reels all day about screen time for my child and this and that. I'm like, take your own advice, people. Like, you're sending freaking reels all day. Maybe you need less screen time. Don't worry about my kid. We're doing the best we can. I laugh at I saw a really funny reel that stuck with me that was like, when you responded to a DM 7 years ago and now you're watching a talking blueberry at 6 a.m. And I was like, it's so true. So funny. But that's the kind of stuff where my sister sent me one that was hilarious. It was like, when you don't get your 10,000 steps, it's like people are the shared experience of America is that we're drowning. We have kids. We're trying not to look at screens so much, and we all want to lose weight. That is the fucking shared American experience right now.
Intermediated through screens, too fat, like a complete reduction of any kind of expectations.
My husband's like, wow, Instagram really just wants you to be fit or fat. Like every other thing, it's like, here's a fitness thing, but also here's an amazing recipe for cinnamon rolls. You're like, I'm getting mixed messages, Instagram. Stressing me out.
Well, that's the other nature of like capitalism, right? It co-opts everything, right?
Yeah.
It literally like fuck the man becomes the best-selling t-shirt of all time.
Yeah. I mean, I have a bit that I'm doing. I kind of want to do a bit. I don't think anyone's done this yet, but I really want to get one of my bits sponsored. I want to talk about how capitalism has co-opted everything, but it would be amazing if I could get an actual bit sponsored. Like, who's ever done that? Like, look, these clubs aren't paying well, guys. What do you expect me to do? I have to fucking get my individual bit sponsored. It might open up Pandora's box and like ruin comedy forever, but I haven't seen it yet. It would be amazing if I could get a bit sponsored by like some fucking huge corporation. It'd be amazing.
And
Capitalism always wins.
If you were asking me to bet on it, I would bet absolutely. I'd even give you odds. You will get some company to sponsor a bit about capitalism co-opting.
No, I'm
everything.
already in talks with somebody about a bit that I wanted to do because they are somebody I'm working with on like a sponsorship. And then they're like, well, don't do that bit and save it and write us ads. And I was like, or better yet, I'll write you ads, but you can also sponsor my bit. He's like, I'm open to it. I'm like, that would be amazing. Amazing.
But then of course, like, what's the alternative, right? I do think that it's like, I think a lot of this sometimes comes down to fashion, right? Like, if you look, I love history. And if you look at history, like I was reading about like the times leading up to Napoleon in France. And like in the early part of the period when he wasn't around, the fashion at court, right, was for women, like your piece about the woman bringing boobs back, right? The fashion at court was basically women wore see-through tops where you could fully see their breasts.
Yeah.
And then like you go forward like 40 years, which isn't a long period of time. And all of a sudden they're all wearing like complete clothes. I mean, like a chador almost, right?
Yeah.
And that transpired in like 40 years. So the pendulum continues to swing, it seems to me.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, I like it. I mean, I think I tend to like, I'm lucky to be in recovery because I feel like it grounds me. Like my favorite comedians right now are guys like Dave Landau, who is just freaking hilarious. But when you hear his stand up, you're like, holy crap, you have been through it. Like he's been through a lot. And when a comedian's talking about what they've been through, like when I joke about recovery or getting sober, or even now I'm doing this joke that's really inappropriate about my first ex-husband who died actually almost a year ago of a fentanyl overdose. My coping mechanism is to joke about it, but it's like people who have been through that stuff, you're like, there's a lot, like you're seeing the tip of the iceberg of like of a lot of stuff. And I think the comedians who have been through it a bit, I joke about this all the time. Like, I don't trust myself enough to be so certain. Like it must be nice to be somebody like, Ben Shapiro, who seems like he's very confident in his opinions and his own beliefs. And perhaps he's had like, I think a lot of that is a function of having good parents who actually tell you like believe in yourself and not getting lost down some rabbit hole of drug addiction where you're like, well, I've lied to myself and everyone around me for years. So I don't know if I can really trust that what I'm spouting now is true, or if it's a cope, or who. I have a better sense of it now. And I think things like having a child are really grounding. I do think just not enough people have kids. Like, not enough young people are having kids. So they're online spending all this time and energy on this like culture war stuff when I'm like, you don't have time for this shit when you have a child. You just don't have time for it to take up any kind of real estate in your mind at all. You are literally in survival mode all the time. All the time. I don't know how people with more than one do it. I have one toddler and it's like, holy shit. My sister-in-law has 3 and I'm like, how do you do this? I'm one of 5. I don't know how my mom did it. And we were 7 years apart. I mean, maybe people just had less time for this kind of nonsense, because it does feel a lot like nonsense.
Totally. You go from, I have 3 kids, 5 grandchildren, and going from 2 to 3 is like going from one-on-one to zone defense, basically.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
and you are totally right. Like, it really, really brings you back down to reality, to when you're changing your first child, who happens to be a boy, when you're changing his diapers and you don't know to cover because he's going to pee all
in your
over
eye.
you. Exactly. Actually happened to me.
Yeah, nothing so humbling as changing a shit, like putting your hand in shit at 3 a.m. or crying because you can't get that fucking third snapped on the onesie as you're just desperately trying to get them changed at 4 o'clock in the morning with no sleep. It's like, I don't know that. And then even just like having a home, and this is where I think the American dream has kind of what the erosion of the ability for people to get a house, just the amount of time having a house takes up would be good for a lot of people. If you care about getting Americans back to some semblance, try and make it easier for them to get home so they can spend a lot of time worrying about their yards and putting all of this excess energy that they're putting into like stupid shit online into what kind of freaking fertilizer they should be getting and how often they should be watering their trees. Like, we need to bring people back. This is where I think Mary Harrington is so right about everything. Like, we need to be more embodied. Children will, and I think people who have kids, if you have teen kids, you are exposed to all of the progressive ideology, you're exposed to like the younger, you also realize like they're going to grow out of it. A lot of it comes from what you're teaching them. What are the values you're instilling? You should know that your kids are, a lot of these kids that are kind of captured by this ideology are often children of divorce. They don't have stable home life. They're not having people who are paying enough attention to them, or they're split between 2 parents. So I don't know. I think that like a lot of it, if you have kids, you're also kind of like, oh, it's like not that, like some of the things it'll make you more radical. Like, I want to fight to get men out of the freaking sports and my daughter's changing areas in the bathrooms. And that way I'm like, I've become more of a radical turf, I guess. And other ways you're like, they'll grow out of it. Some of the social media panic too. I'm like, I love Jonathan Haidt, love him and respect his work, but I'm like, they did this with us with TV. Like, I lived through this. Everybody was freaking out that we're all going to be, I mean, and maybe it's true. Maybe we are all morons because of television and I just am a boiling frog in water. But they were very concerned that nobody would learn anything and I don't know, that like society would shut down because all of the children watch TV. And I was watching like 4 hours of cartoons every day after school for a while in my youth. I don't know. It felt like a little bit of a moral panic.
Moral panics, like they're as old as civilization, right? Like,
yeah.
you could, like, one of the first things that they I'm sure that this might be apocryphal, but one of the first translations of the earliest text that they ever found was ancient Sumerian, where it was by a young poet saying, fuck it, man, all the good poems have already been written. Right?
It's all just a circle.
And then you remember like Tipper Gore and the whole putting warnings on rap labels and like,
yeah.
And I was like in my early or late 20s, early 30s when all that shit was going on. And I'm just kind of like, I got to go check this out.
Yeah.
rather than like, oh, this is horrible. And I'm like, oh, this might be really, really cool.
What idiot thought it was a good idea to dare teenagers not to do drugs? Like, who thought that was a good idea? You're like, okay, well, I'll show you. You're on, lady. Like,
yeah, and you want to get teens to start smoking. It requires
you should have dared me to do them.
Yeah, exactly, and exactly. You want teen smoking to skyrocket? Enforce that all cigarettes must have a skull and crossbones on the pack, and you will see teenage smoking soar. Like, the other thing that just always freaked me out was like I would be with friends who were older than me, so more traditional baby boomers, right? And like at a cocktail party, and they're all like with their cell phones, and I'm like, "What are you doing?" And they're like, "Oh, I'm just seeing what my daughter is typing to her friend." And I'm like, "What do you mean?" Oh, they've got spyware on their fucking kids' cell phones. And I'm like, excuse me? Like, do you remember all the drugs? Do you remember all the sex?
These kids are so much better than we ever were.
No
They're
kidding.
so much better.
I mean, but oh my God, I can't even imagine. Like, that just so offended me that the generation which would like free love, free drugs, Woodstock, suddenly they're 1984ing their children with spy apps on their phone. Like, that just, to me, it just smacks a lot. And maybe what we're getting angry about is just, when did it become okay to be just transparently hypocritical? When was it okay where like all the shit you did, right? And had a great, by the way, let's be honest, had a great time doing it.
Yeah.
And then suddenly, no, we're going to bar it all. We're going to bar cell phones. We're going to bar every last thing.
Yeah, that's weird too, because boomers seem to have no resilience when it comes to the phone at all. They're like, I joke about this all the time. They're like the first generation exposed to smallpox. Like, they have just no immunity to it. They fall for every scam. We're always having to like stop our parents from getting caught in a scam. They're constant. They were very like resistant to phones, but now that they have them, we just experienced this with my daughter. Had a party, or it was like a holiday, and both our parents, our fathers, were present, and they were both like on their phones, in front of, like, she's like trying to get their attention. I was like, these boomers have like no resilience at all, no resistance to like the draw of cell phones whatsoever. It's wild, actually. I feel like I'm definitely addicted to my phone in ways that are not healthy and drive me crazy in the same way that kind of everybody talks about it. But I know how to like put it in another room or put it away or just walk away from it. It's interesting. And the younger generations, like, it's very intuitive. My husband and I joke we want to do like a sketch where it's like 2-year-olds are the people who test these iPhones, and they're like, oh, the 2-year-old doesn't get it. We need to make it simpler, because it's like she's swiping things away. And this is another meme that all parents pass around. And it's like 2-year-olds can't Velcro their shoes, can't do like all these things, and it's like 2-year-olds in front of a tablet, and it's like the scene from
Minority Report.
Yes.
Right? They could do that shit all day long, but
We're like,
can't
how
buy
did
the
you
juice.
get past our passcode? And you're like, in our phone. How did you even do that? She's just like swiping around. Like,
Yeah, it's like looking at you, Mom, easy peasy. Come on. The thing about phones is, so I'm the martini baby, right? I'm 6 or 7 years younger than my next sibling. And clearly, I thank God all the time that mom and dad got hammered on martinis and created me. But like, so my sisters are all like real boomers, right?
yeah.
And I used to tell them when cell phones were just coming out, I'm like, you guys got to get cell phones. You got to get cell phones. I'm like, I don't need that. So anyway, I was talking to one of my oldest sister, and I said, did you ever get a cell phone? She goes, oh yeah, I've had one for a year. And I'm like, well, I don't even have the number. And she goes, well, I don't have it turned on. And I'm like, what do you mean you don't have it turned on? What do you mean you don't have it turned on? Well, it's just for emergencies, right? But they went from that to like, I would call a landline, because they all still have landlines too. And I would call their landline, and they would pick it up and say, hey, Jim, call me back on my cell.
Right.
It's a bit like social media. Like, I have a friend in tech who is like, well, of course, social media got totally fucked up because it was all basically created by these genius autistic people who had no idea how normies would actually use the social media, right?
They're like, this is how we would use it. And normies are like, we're going to destroy civilization. Thanks.
Exactly.
Oh, you
my
would
God.
use it that way? Well, we're going to use it to destroy democracy and spy on our children.
Exactly. It's like,
And the irony of like none of them allowing their kids on screens. We're like, you guys are the fucking drug dealers who don't get high on your own supply.
exactly. It's like my friend Rob Henderson calls them luxury beliefs, right?
Oh yeah, I love him.
I've talked to him so often about this, and he's very like, he's a fairly serious guy, but when you get him maybe more in the humor zone, he gets pretty funny about riffing on luxury beliefs and how fucked up they are, right?
Yeah.
Like, no, the defund the police, says the person with the private security force. Who?
That's like all these women who are like, sex work is work. I'm like, so again, let's play this tape forward. You want little Athena, or whatever the fuck weird name you gave your kid, to be a stripper? And it's like, oh God, no, I'm paying for her to go to USC. I'm buying her way into USC. Like it's like, yeah, that was when I talked to the women who are the women's liberation. They're fighting against like the California men in women's prisons. The Women's Wolf is the organization. And they were hilarious, but they're like, we look at what these women are doing and not what they're saying. It's like, what are they doing versus what they're saying? And always they're doing the complete opposite of what they're saying. So, and it always it like ends up affecting the kind of middle to lower classes. Usually the cost gets passed on to the poor.
Exactly. And that, just like, I would just be so exhausted if I was constantly saying one thing and doing another. It's like on Wall Street, the quip is, don't tell me what you like, show me what's in your portfolio, right? Don't talk to me about shit. Show me what you actually do. What you do is what you are.
Right. And that's the thing about luxury beliefs, is they get away with it because it's theoretical. It's like, well, in theory, sex work is work. And then when you push them to say, that's why I'm like, all these people who talk about gender affirming care, politicians, you need to push them to go on record and state exactly what that means in reality, not gender affirming care, this theory. So you are okay with giving a 12-year-old testosterone or some kind of hormones that will make it, in effect, basically impossible for them to have children or orgasm later in life. That is what happens when you do this, and make them go on record and state this. Sex work is work. So you would be okay with your daughter becoming a sex worker. That is a path that you would not only be okay with, but you would promote for her. Like, that's a viable career path that you would encourage your daughter to take. Because that is what you're essentially saying if you believe sex work is work. You believe it is just as valid as little Jenny becoming a doctor. Like, no, that's not something you want for your child. That's like not something you're supporting them in doing unless you're Kim Kardashian's mom. And then
Well, but it's also,
maybe you realize it's a path to becoming a billionaire.
But it's also the abstraction, right? Like, as you were talking, I'm thinking about that famous Stalin quote, which he probably didn't say, but a single death is a tragedy, a million are a statistic, right?
Yeah.
And so when you get into this, like, would you actually do that? Would you actually let your child do that? And like, they're horrified. Well, then why are you espousing all this bullshit and promoting it? Right? Because that has downstream effects on people who don't have the luxury, luxury beliefs, right? They actually have to, live in that world you're creating.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's like, I can't remember who the VC, I can't remember who the VC was who quipped that, like, rich people had reality privilege.
Yeah.
like listening to it, but he's fucking right. You know what I mean? It's like all of the rest of it, if you're espousing all this bullshit and then you yourself can go squirrel yourself away wherever that's safe and, not imposing any of that stuff on your family, it just seems so ridiculously hypocritical to me.
Yeah, I don't think that people see it as hypocritical because I think they really believe it. It's because, like you said, it's theoretical. So it's not something where it's actually tangible, like these boomers who grew up burning their bras and free love and all became like massive capitalists and like, are spying on their children, where there's a past that they can reflect on. This is all just like, oh, in theory, this world we're creating that doesn't really exist, and we don't have to actually suffer any of the consequences of it existing. Like, when you defund the police, it's usually lower middle class who suffer the consequences. When you have like sex work is work, you and legalize prostitution, it's the girls who are being trafficked who suffer, because now there's less of a reason for the police to stop somebody who might be in a dangerous situation, not of her own volition. So it's like, you're not worrying about your little Sally or Athena. You're not even worrying about any of those women on the street because you're completely disconnected from how that, downstream consequence of that. So I don't think they believe they're hypocrites because they have nothing to compare it to. It's just like they believe it and they think they're on the right side of history.
And I think when you look around the world, that disconnect is one of the things that's causing a lot of the, just the incredible weirdness of our current moment in time, right? Well, Bridget, like, I haven't even gotten to like half my notes. Like, I haven't talked about your writing. I haven't talked about a bunch of other things. So like, I think
my husband's putting her down, so we're fine if you have burning questions.
Very cool. So I do, actually. So when I was young, my mother, who beat manners into me and whatnot, took me aside once and she said, "Jim, yeah, you use humor as a weapon." And I'm like, "What do you mean?" And then she told me, she's like, you're pretty funny. But what I have been noticing is that you use being funny to, like, maybe say things that if they weren't funny would be very hurtful to people. What do you think about that? Because one of the things that I have noticed, like, people with no sense of humor, I literally do not want to hang out with. Like, I use that as a screen. If somebody has no sense of humor, I find that there's like something wrong with them, something fundamentally wrong with them. And the funny people, like reading your essays and stuff, and then a lot of the people in my life who are really really funny people also have a dark side and have maybe been through some shit. Like, do you think there's a line between using humor as a weapon or just like let them fly?
I don't know. It's like, it's tough because I don't think, I think we all know when someone's joke is coming from a place of bitterness or anger. You know, I think people can sense that. So if you're joking, I do think intention matters. And I think one of the reasons I was hesitant to joke about my ex-husband was because he has 3 kids, and I'm sensitive to the fact that they'll grow up and maybe we'll hear these jokes in the off chance that they ever make it out of my little bubble or whatever. And every time I told them, they kept getting a laugh. And then I was like, God damn it, why does this get a laugh? But I think because we have a fentanyl crisis in America, people don't know how to cope with it. And it's like it alleviates some of that. But it's also me coping with something that I don't really know how to cope with other than laughing at it. So I think like one of the things that used to make me really mad was when people would kind of try and police me laughing at or making rape jokes, which I think is a good example. Some people will say no rape jokes ever. People have been raped and they shouldn't have to like hear these jokes that can be even more traumatic, etc. I am like, that's not fair. I have been raped, and I think a very funny rape joke is hilarious. Now, I use humor as a coping mechanism. I think it's a way to take the power away from something. If you have been victimized in that sense, you're saying I can, once enough like healing has been done, obviously, a lot of the time when you're like a stand-up comedian is starting, you're like, oh, you're using this as therapy and probably need to like go work through this with a therapist before you can be able to joke about it. Because sometimes you're like, oh, you're obviously in a lot of pain and you're using this to cope, but there's not very much like emotional maturity or healing that's happening. So it feels, I think that's the other thing that happens. You'll feel it when someone's bitter, or you feel it when somebody's like trying to work through something and they haven't really worked through it yet. I used to do a joke about how my dad told me that he had this like awkward conversation with me when I was 37. And he was like, hey, Bridget, have you considered freezing your eggs? And I was like, Dad, isn't that a little bit like putting the chicken in the freezer after it's been in the fridge for 7 days? Like, it's already borderline. And people would get so sad for me and they'd be like, oh, nobody would laugh. It was always, and I was really I was at that age when I was making those jokes and I didn't understand like the pity because I'd be like, don't feel bad for me. I made this choice. But now having a child very late in life, like, kind of coming back in the bottom of the ninth, I I kind of understand where that pity was coming from because it was something I hadn't really worked through. Like I hadn't really figured out how I felt about it. So I think people were sensing something that even I wasn't sensing about wanting to have kids that I wasn't necessarily even aware of. So they weren't able to laugh at the joke because um they were like picking up on something that even I wasn't picking up on. I
Yeah.
wasn't resolved in it. Like I wasn't fully resolved in it. And I think the audience was sensing that, hence why they were reacting with like, oh, sad, barren woman who doesn't have kids, instead of like what I was thinking was like, I'm empowered and like I made this choice. Who cares? But they were, and if you have kids, you're like, oh, that's sad for you because you'll never know what you don't know. So I do think humor is like, so much of it is Can jokes go too far? Yes. Should you be allowed to make whatever joke you want? Yes. You can't really find the edge of humor. Carlin used to say your job is to kind of find the edge and go past it. So you can't do that if you can't do that. You've got to make, and Chris Rock has famously said stand-up comedy is the only art form where in order to get better, you have to publicly fail. You have to basically, you can't like sit in your room and learn chords and learn a song and then come out on stage and sing it. You've got, the only way I'm going to find out if these bits work that I write in my computer and try in my head and in my shower when I'm rehearsing them is if I take them on stage. And sometimes you'll have a bit that just isn't working for whatever reason, no matter how many times you try and put that square peg in a round hole. The audience isn't responding. It's something in you. You're coming from too much anger. You're coming from sadness that hasn't been fully resolved. Who fucking knows? Sometimes it's where the climate and the culture is. Sometimes it's too soon. I don't think that there should be any parameters put on humor. I think that societies that don't have it, it's like the Joker is a very important cultural symbol for a reason. And trickster, there's this, I mean, before even Jokers, we had the trickster mythology, which is like, I think that of all the mythologies, archetypes that you would ask me who I identify with, it's trickster always. It's like he who dupes others and who also dupes himself. And there's this great book, Trickster Makes This World, and it explores all of the trickster mythologies and how there's this amazing quote that's like, through his actions, all like he has no morals, but through his actions, all morals kind of come into being. And I think that this is your role as someone who's doing comedy, it's not to like punch up or punch down or speak truth to power. That's all part of it. But really it's like to kind of explore whatever hidden paradigms and things that were like the things we're taking for granted, the obvious like water that we're swimming in, to point that out. It's not just to like take down power. It's also to just observe reality and how absurd it is. Life is absurd. No matter what generation of humanity you've lived through, it is always and forever absurd. I mean, we have enough historical record of people documenting the absurdity of the human experience to know that this is a condition we all share throughout time. And I don't think it's going to get any better.
Yeah. And like, I think of Lenny Bruce saying that you can't fake funny. Basically, you get instant feedback. I still remember the first time I went to see my daughter, Lael, do stand-up comedy. And I was like, I looked at her and I said, I've given speeches about investing and stuff to like 20,000, 30,000 people, but I would never, ever have the guts to do what you are about to go do. Because the feedback is instantaneous. I think you're absolutely right about it. You can't fake funny, right? You can't, like, if you think a bit is really good and it doesn't land,
it's your problem.
That's your problem.
Yeah.
And like, I also think of the other quote. I can't remember who said it, but it's like, if you're going to tell the truth, you better be fucking funny, because if you're not, they'll kill you.
I think that was like Mark Twain or someone. Yeah.
Well,
I love that quote.
Yeah. Twain also had against the assault of laughter, nothing can last. Right. And I was thinking, I was reading Martin, he just died, Martin Amis. And I was reading his memoirs, which he chose to write in the form of a novel. And basically what he was saying was, people don't understand that the function of humor, the function of mocking, for example, is to call all of those control freak, authoritarian, totalitarian types to call them on the carpet, right? And he goes, it is not lost on me that Hitler made mockery of anything he did punishable by death. right?
Yeah.
And so I think
Yeah.
we just need a lot. We need to laugh a lot more, because you're right. Like, literally, none of us are getting out alive, right? And so
I laughed so hard that whole weekend. That was one thing. Like, the people I was with, I was like, I'm surrounding myself with the right group of people, because we had so much fun that whole weekend in New York at Dissident Dialogues. Like, first night I went to a dinner and I was next to Michael Moynihan, who is fucking hilarious. And he and I were, I had tears coming down my cheeks laughing with him through the whole dinner. And just like Clyde from Substack, who I love, who's Australian, and Australians just have the best sense of humor. And then it was a lot of Brits there, and they have a great sense of humor. Eric Nelson, who's freaking hilarious, the editor over at HarperCollins. Just a lot of very funny people. The women were all extremely funny. Just funny. It was like I spent the whole entire weekend laughing, and even just watching some of these panels with people. We were watching the Ion Richard Dawkins panel about God and how she came to God. And I felt like a toddler. Like, the first 10 minutes, my emotions were all over the place. The first 10 minutes where she's talking about how she came to Christ were moving, because as someone who has been on my knees, humbled, rock bottom, I know exactly what she's describing. I know that moment of saying, I don't want to live. I don't know. I know it. I've been there. I've been there multiple times, but it sounds like that's what happened to her after kind of fighting depression for 10 years. I mean, this will be public soon, so I don't feel like I'm sharing something I shouldn't. And then she kind of found, someone told her, like, have you tried praying? And it actually saved her, which I've heard many times from people. And as someone who went into recovery and was very like, raised Catholic, allergic to God a little bit, I had to come to my own easy peace with God. And and the genius of the 12 steps is like, of your understanding. So I understood that, but then Dawkins was a little bit like mocking her, as you know, he does, as all atheists do somewhat, which I've always understood because I went through a phase of atheism, but also I don't really, the reason I pulled away from it is like, I'm not in the business of like pulling the life raft out from under anybody. I think people use whatever they need to use. Again, life is absurd. It's also tragic, and it's fragile, and it can go from being hilarious to you're never going to wake up the same person ever again in a instant. And so I'm not really in the business of pulling whatever life raft people need to get through it out from under them either. And he was mocking, then he started coughing, and I looked at my friends I was watching it with, and I was like, wouldn't it be funny if he died right now? Like, how many people would be converted to Christianity? Like, how many atheists would become believers immediately? And they're like, Bridget, don't say that. And then he kept on coughing. They're like, this is on you. This is on you. But it's like that levity of like, it's just, I don't know if it's like comedian brain where you just go to that, like, what's the most absurd but hilarious thing that could happen right now. And it's like, if he, in the middle of making fun of Ion for believing in God, like just keeled over, because he's 85 or something. He's not young. He seemed a little fragile when he was coming out. Like,
and you're absolutely right. That would be hysterical.
Hilarious.
like even better if it was like a lightning bolt that just killed him dead.
They're like, this is on you. You're a witch. We're watching you. I was like, come on, you thought about it. They were like, we did. It did cross my mind. And the funny thing about comedy is that if I got up and did a routine after that set and said that, I promise you, hundreds of people had that thought in that audience. Like,
Yep.
Even if it was a fleeting thought, like, oh, what if he died right now? That'd be pretty fucked up, but it would also be kind of like hilarious. And would you become a believer?
And it just makes me think of Matt Groening and The Simpsons, right? Like they do that all the time. I think I was actually watching one of your things where you show one of The Simpsons with Kennedy driving along.
Yeah.
Basically saying, oh, I'm a Kennedy, nothing can touch me. And then the car
Well, and it's like that. I'm like, all of my belief in God comes from a Calvin and Hobbes comic. And I've talked about this before, where it's Calvin and Hobbes and they're sitting. This is why Watterson is the greatest genius of our time, truly. But it's Calvin and Hobbes, and and Hobbes looks at Calvin and they're sitting on top of a hill, just like looking out over a pretty vista. And he's like, Calvin, do you believe in God? And then another frame of silence where, Calvin's contemplating this. And then he looks directly at us, the audience, and he's like, well, someone's out to get me. It's like, in a nutshell, my entire theology.
I absolutely love it.
Calvin, Bridget, do you believe in God? Well, someone's out to get me.
This has been so much fun. I'm getting the hook because I have something coming up.
No worries.
But tell us where, I know where to find you, but tell our listeners and viewers where to find you. A better question would be, where can't they find you?
You can't find me. No, the best place is PHETASY.com, and I put out a newsletter. Just subscribe to the free newsletter, or you can follow me on social media at Bridget Phetasy on not TikTok, sorry. I think we are on TikTok now, but I'm not running it. And I'm on Instagram and Twitter at Bridget Phetasy if you want to follow me on social media, and Facebook, and I never really use Facebook, but sometimes just to see who's dying. And then
same here.
God, Facebook is just, I used to joke that it's like a nursing home, but every time I check in, it's like, oh, so-and-so died of cancer. I'm like, Jesus Christ. It is just like
Facebook is death's waiting room. It is death's waiting room. And it is the highest market cap birthday reminder that exists.
Yeah. Yep. You can find me there, but Phetasy.com is the best place. And then, our YouTube channel is Phetasy. So please subscribe there for free. It's all free unless you want to become a member. And then you get to see me working awkwardly out my stand-up comedy in front of a room full of gay people. That is the funniest thing about all of the stand-up that I'm posting behind that paywall, is that the show I have a residency at is basically, it's called The Gay Enough Show. My friend Ariel Isaac Norman, who's like a base lesbian, she runs it and she's a comedian. She's been nice enough to give me a residency while I'm getting back my feet wet. But it's like nobody ever has children. No, they're just, I don't know what I'm doing. Like but I feel like if I can make them laugh, I can make anyone laugh, because they like all the sex stuff, but I'm like, hey, you know how I know I'm getting older? It's because I agree with my HOA. I do, by the way. You agree with them.
All right. So our final question on the podcast is always, we're going to wave a magic wand. We're going to make you the empress of the world. You can't kill anybody. You can't put anybody in a re-education camp. But what you can do is we're going to give you a magical microphone, and you can say two things into it. And the two things that you say are going to incept all 8 billion plus people on the world. The next day they're going to wake up. They're going to think that they had these two ideas, and that unlike all of the other great ideas they had, they're going to act on both of these two. What are you going to incept in the world?
Oh, I don't know. That's a tough one. You are going to die. I would remind them of that. I think that's a very important, like, baseline place to come from every day. We all know it, but we don't remember it. Yeah, exactly. It's very like, you are going to die, and just keep going.
Until you die.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't have really great wisdom. It's pouring and lightning and thundering right now. I love it. All the great wisdom I have has been said before me. It's just like, don't take it all so seriously. Do your best. I don't know. It's like very simple shit. I feel like
I
make it really complicated.
I love both of those, because, like, you're right, memento mori, we're all going to die, right? And we often forget that. So That sometimes, like, if you think sometimes, like, what would happen if I died tonight? Would I be happy with what I did today?
Yeah.
Have I told the people that I love that I love them?
Yeah.
You know, and that leads to like a more embodied life, I think. And then just
Definitely.
keep going, just keep going. I actually love because like that's what keeps everything going. Just keep going, right?
Yeah.
I absolutely love that. Bridget,
It
this has
is
been
pouring right now. Pouring. It's like sideways raining. I wonder if I
well,
can
that's
show
because
you.
I didn't even get to the difference between California and oh my God. No shit. Holy God.
I know, it's nuts. I love it.
Everything's bigger in Texas. That reminds me of the Onion headline. Texan who went to Harvard doesn't know which one to mention first.
That's funny. I like that.
All right, Bridget. Thank you so much.